Welcome to the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights November monthly webinar. I am Nina Beth Carden, the director of the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights. Our organization believes that environmental health is a fundamental human right for everyone, no matter their circumstance or zip code. To codify that right in law, we're dedicated to placing in the Maryland State Constitution an amendment that ensures that everyone, as a matter of human dignity, has the right to a healthful environment. This amendment would ensure that everyone has access to clean air, clean water, a healthy ecosystem, no matter who or where they are. We invite you to learn more about us and join our efforts by visiting our website at mdehr.org. We'll put that in the chat so you can have that. And we do hope that you visit our website, correspond with us, connect with us. We could use your help to get this amendment passed. And today we are so very pleased to introduce to you a wonderful, creative, inspiring scholar, Alexandria Casteel. And I want to offer a brief shout out and thank you to Morgan Grove, research forester with the U.S. Forest Service, and someone I think is a Pied Piper of fascinating people for introducing us to Alexandria. Alexandria Casteel is an environmental anthropology graduate student at Dartmouth College. Her research interests include environmental justice and specifically how racism, including practices of redlining and segregation, shape how Black residents in Baltimore City come to care about nature and the environment. Today, she'll be sharing more about that work, and she'll be sharing more about herself and how she came to this work. We invite you to put questions in the chat throughout the talk, and we're hoping that we can reserve about 15 minutes at the end to have an open dialogue with Alexandria. So once again, thank you all for being here. If you're just joining us, if you can put your name and any affiliation you wish to tell about yourselves in the chat, and join us. Please do mute yourself during the time that Alexandria is presenting. Put questions in the chat, and then we hope to have a conversation with you at the end. So with that, Alexandria, I am thrilled to turn this over to you.
Just going to go ahead and get my slideshow started here. So thank you so much for the introduction, Nina. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandria Casteel, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Ecology, Evolution, Environment, and Society graduate program at Dartmouth College, which is located in Hanover, New Hampshire. It's always such a pleasure to be able to share more about my work. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to give this talk on my dissertation research entitled Environmental Justice and Other Stories, Black Environmentalism in Baltimore City. This topic is deeply motivated by my personal and intellectual interest, including the Ecology of Racism book project that I have the privilege of being a part of alongside Laura Ogden, my faculty advisor at Dartmouth College, urban ecologists like Stuart Pickett, who was the founding director of the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, and environmental social scientists like Morgan Grove, who works for the USDA Forest Service Field Station in Baltimore. So today I'll talk more about my involvement with this interdisciplinary work, along with my dissertation research in Baltimore. So my goal for this presentation today is to share more about my dissertation research in Baltimore City, including some preliminary fieldwork I did this past summer in July and August, as well as the future direction of my work. Additionally, I will also spend some time talking about my involvement in the Ecology of Racism book project. And with that, I've really structured my talk into three parts. The first, entitled The Ecology of Racism, will discuss my involvement in the book and situate my research within the framing of this interdisciplinary research agenda. The second, entitled Environmental Justice in the City, will discuss previous ecological and environmental justice research in Baltimore done by the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, which is a part of the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research project in the city. And lastly, part three, entitled Black Environmentalism, is intended to advance my own research agenda. And here I'll spend some time talking about my summer fieldwork and some of the many Black environmental care and stewardship practices I observed, ranging from forestry and park stewardship to dye plant farming and community gardening, in addition to some more traditional environmental justice concerns. But before diving right into part one of the talk, I would like to first spend a bit more time sharing more about myself and what motivates my interest in this work. So about me, I come to this work as an environmental anthropologist, really interested in telling stories about environmental care and repair through the lens of race, and specifically the efforts of Black communities to engage in that work. But I also come to this work as a Black woman living in what Black feminist scholar Christina Sharp describes as the wake, which has become a powerful mode of witnessing and attunement. For example, bearing witness to the ongoing forms of racial and environmental violence around the world have been pivotal in shaping my interest in environmental anthropology, helping me navigate my position in my graduate program at Dartmouth College, and my dissertation's focus on how legacies of structural racism, including redlining and segregation, shape the ways that Black communities relate to nature and urban environments. My multiple identities and at times precarious positioning within the academy impact the way that I think about whose stories count and why they matter during global environmental and climate crisis. As an ethnographic writer and storyteller, I'm deeply committed to increasing Black people's opportunities to self-define their connections to land and place, while also celebrating their solutions and adaptive strategies for shaping relationships to nature that support their own desires. And apart from environmental justice and responding to environmental harms, however, we seldom hear those stories about Black joy and healing in nature. And so I'm increasingly motivated to take part in elevating those stories as well, which I'll spend a little time talking a bit more about in part 3 on Black environmentalism in the city. But before I sketch out the landscape of what I'm calling Black environmentalism, I'd like to first share a bit more about my involvement in the ecology of racism and how the framing of this interdisciplinary research agenda provides a useful foundation for my own research in the city. So, The Ecology of Racism is the title of a book project for Yale Press. And collaborators on the project include Morgan Grove, Stuart Pickett, Christopher Boone, Dean and Professor of the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University, Mary Cadenasso, plant scientist and urban ecologist at UC Davis, Laura Ogden, my faculty advisor at Dartmouth College, Ann Rademacher, urban political ecologist and environmental studies professor at New York University, Dexter Locke, data scientist at the Forest Service Field Station in Baltimore, and more recently myself, as the lead authors invited me to join this project as a co-author last fall. And I jumped at the opportunity to be a part of this interdisciplinary team of scientists and social scientists. My involvement in this project really consisted of collecting interview data and reviewing literature on Black intellectual contributions to ecology and urban systems, which has become a key body of literature shaping my dissertation research. Empirically, the book builds on authors' long-term research in cities in the United States, as well as internationally, to build its conceptual framing. And much of this empirical work comes out of research supported by the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research programs in Baltimore, which I'll talk more about in a later slide, as well as Phoenix and comparative work in other cities, including Boston, Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Los Angeles. Two things that I personally find most compelling about the book's conceptual framing is that, one, it brings issues such as race and racism, which have largely been avoided across the sciences and other academic disciplines, to bear on ecology and ecological science as a practice. And two, it names racism as a complex and resilient system in cities that must be disrupted or dismantled in an ongoing effort to produce anti-racist urban environments that are more sustainable and just. One of the broad guiding questions framing this work is, what are the environmental consequences of institutionalized racism, including the spatial segregation of people by race? And answering such a question, as my collaborators note, has enormous potential to boost the contributions of ecological science to problems like climate change adaptation, stewardship, and sustainability. And while racism is often thought about exclusively as a social problem or existing outside the realm of sustainability and sustainable development concerns, what the ecology of racism, as well as other scholarship, has shown is that racism not only has severe social consequences, but also ecological ones as well, which I'll talk about in greater detail over the coming slides. So, to prepare for the book project and my upcoming qualifying exams, I've really spent much of the past 2 academic years reviewing 2 key sites of literature: the literature on environmental justice, as well as the literature on race and urban systems. And over the next couple of slides or so, I'll talk in greater detail about each body of literature and how it's shaping my work. So, environmental justice is a social movement and body of scholarship that really emerged in the 1980s in response to the disproportionate environmental burdens borne by communities of color. And what may well come to mind when you hear environmental justice, or at least what comes to mind for me, is perhaps the first national protest of environmental toxics in the form of a PCB landfill by hundreds of Black Americans and civil rights activists in Warren County, North Carolina. Now, if I may, I'd like to share a short video, less than 5 minutes or so, really detailing the events of Warren County, which really set the stage for the environmental justice movement.
In a small, predominantly African-American community in eastern North Carolina called Warren County, African Americans and white activists joined together in protest, what's described as a merger of civil rights and environmentalism.
The whole environmental justice movement as a movement really took off in Warren County, because this was a case study where people basically drew a line in the dirt and said no more.
For nearly 4 years, the residents of Warren County have been protesting the state of North Carolina's plan to transport PCB-contaminated soil to a landfill in their community. When the trucks began to roll, angered residents decided they'd had enough, and in a nonviolent act of civil disobedience, they blocked the road.
You had primarily a lot of African-American women and their children who literally laid down in the streets to block the trucks from dumping polychlorinated biphenyls, PCB, in a toxic waste landfill in their community. And here's an agriculture community where the aquifer level is very shallow near the surface, where most people have wells, get their drinking water from wells. And the thought that the state would pick this county of all of the 100 counties in North Carolina as a dumping site was just unthinkable.
The Warren County incident triggered a whole series of investigations into the relationship between race and toxics. In 1983, the General Accounting Office examined the placement of off-site commercial hazardous waste landfills in 8 states in the Southeast. What they found was that 3 out of 4 were located in predominantly poor and African-American communities, in a region where African-Americans comprise only 20% of the population.
Now, that's disproportionate impact. That is not a random distribution. In other words, you're only 20% of the population, but 3 out of 4 of the landfills. And that's the first government study that actually documented this particular pattern.
In 1987, the United Church of Christ's Commission on Racial Justice issued its first report on toxic wastes and race in the U.S. The report's findings stirred up a big national debate about the relationship between where people live, the race of those communities, and the location of the toxic waste facility.
What the 1987 report did was it verified beyond a shadow of a doubt that in terms of the location of toxic waste facilities, those are commercial, licensed, and those uncontrolled sites, those are not licensed. You find an overwhelming disproportionate amount of these facilities in African-American communities, in Latino American communities, and other people of color communities.
The report concluded that 3 out of every 5 Hispanic and African Americans lived in areas with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. Reverend Ben Chavis, executive director of the commission at that time, coined this phenomenon, environmental racism.
Environmental racism is racial discrimination in environmental policymaking. It is the deliberate targeting of racial and ethnic communities for environmental facilities, hazard facilities like toxic waste landfills, incinerators. It is also the disproportionate presence of point generation sources of toxins like petrochemical facilities.
In 1992, the National Law Journal released the findings of its own investigation.
One of the things that became really clear to us in our data was that polluters in white communities get higher penalties for violating the law than polluters in minority communities. And that is not the case if you compare high income and low income areas. Their penalties are virtually the same.
The study also found that the government had taken longer to address hazards in Superfund sites located in minority communities and accepted less stringent cleanup plans.
I think once people find out what the real dangers of environmental injustice are, there are a lot of dangers, people will really get involved. Because we often say that the issue of environmental racism is an issue of life and death. It's just not an issue of some form of prejudice where somebody doesn't like you because of the color of your skin. This is an issue that will take your life away if you don't get involved.
So stories like these have really helped to solidify a particular image of Black environmental activism and its primary concerns, including highlighting and challenging patterns of environmental racism. And over the past several decades, our understandings of environmental racism have since deepened, as nearly 20 years after the initial report mentioned in the video put forward by the United Church of Christ in 1987, millions of Americans continue to live, work, and play in unsafe and unhealthy environments, with people of color comprising the majority of that population. And today, environmental racism can be as subtle as who gets to go birding and engage in other forms of outdoor recreation safely, blatant as deliberate exclusion of Black communities from environmental leadership and decision-making, and virulent as acts of anti-Black violence. So in this vein, it's really easy to see how environmental racism has become this powerful mobilizing rhetoric for Black activists and environmental advocacy groups nationwide. Alongside environmental racism and the literature on environmental justice, I've also been exploring literature on the intersection of race and urban systems, including this science article entitled The Ecological and Evolutionary Consequences of Systemic Racism in Urban Environments by Shell and his collaborators, which draws some really important links between residential segregation and biological change in urban environments, noting how systemic racism, racial oppression, structural inequality rooted in legacies of colonialism and white supremacy are major drivers of environmental degradation, as well as disparities in health and wealth outcomes in urban environments. And I think to bring a more immediate example to mind, we see the implications of these legacies in the context of COVID-19 as well, right? In that Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC communities, and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted. And in my own research, I build upon these key literatures to ask about forms of Black environmentalism that really go beyond environmental justice, as well as examine why we tend to know so little about Black environmental care and stewardship. But before getting into my research, I'd first like to turn to the second part of the talk and spend a little bit of time talking about the Baltimore Ecosystem Study and some of the amazing environmental justice work that has been done in the city. So, as I mentioned previously, Baltimore is the site of the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research study, which has been investigating the ecological cultural and economic forces shaping the city since 1998. And while the study has focused primarily on some more traditional environmental concerns in the city, such as watersheds, biodiversity, and human environmental perceptions and behaviors, the Baltimore Ecosystem Study has also made some key contributions to environmental justice as well. What decades of environmental justice research in Baltimore has shown is that the city's environmental heterogeneity, or the social and spatial distribution of environmental benefits such as trees and access to quality green space, for example, and environmental burdens such as heat stress, poor air quality, and heavy concentrations of lead in drinking water, for example, are deeply entangled with legacies of uneven development and over 100 years of racist policies and practices, which have segregated Black residents into the eastern and western areas of Baltimore and some parts of the South. As early as 1910, the first racial segregation laws were enacted in the city, which prohibited Black Baltimoreans from moving into white residential neighborhoods. And while the Supreme Court declared these practices of residential segregation unenforceable in 1948, these legacies continue to have a lasting impact on the city today, including what Lawrence Brown has coined as the Black butterfly, which describes this observable landscape feature. Thus, I think what the case of Baltimore really illustrates is how dynamics such as race and racism, along with ecological outcomes, processes, and conditions get co-produced over time, which perhaps further emphasizes the importance of understanding interactions among these historical patterns and processes of segregation for advancing research in urban ecology and allied fields such as my own. And so in my own research, I'm really interested in understanding how legacies of racism, ranging from economic divestment in majority Black East and West Baltimore to a disproportionate exposure of environmental harms in these same neighborhoods, shape how residents come to care about nature and the environment. Now, to transition into part 3 of the talk. So as I mentioned previously, I did do some preliminary fieldwork in Baltimore City this past summer from early July to mid-August. And primed with the ecology of racism and a foundational knowledge of the city's history, I did expect to find some environmental justice issues. So community organizer and environmental activist Glen Ross has been giving toxic tours of primarily East Baltimore for over 20 years and raising awareness about environmental issues impacting these neighborhoods for nearly 40 years, including sites where various forms of pollution affect the health and well-being of residents. I've included a link to the documentary entitled Toxic Tour, put together in collaboration with Glen Ross, which discusses many of these environmental injustices in greater detail. While I did not have the opportunity to connect with Glen Ross during my time there this summer, I did do some exploration of my own. Nearly 3 weeks into my fieldwork in the city, I could hardly breathe the air. And in her meditations on breathing during climate emergency, Black feminist scholar Alexis Pauline Gumbs describes this sensation as drowning, which also describes the lived reality for many low-income Black residents across East, West, and South Baltimore who experience some of the highest rates of asthma in the city. And this is 3 times the national average for asthma-related emergency room visits. Additionally, low-income Black residents are also exposed to heavy concentrations of lead in drinking water, and particularly in public schools. Additionally, low-income Black residents are also largely confined to overcrowded and poor quality housing with few trees and access to quality green space. Consequently, the effects of urban heat stress are also felt, among other compounding environmental and social stressors, including the everyday entrapments of poverty and food apartheid, or food insecurity and inadequate access to nutritious food and fiber, which Eric Jackson, founder and director of the Black Yield Institute in West Baltimore, discusses in his documentary on the topic. Now, many of you all may be familiar with the term food deserts, but food apartheid is the term used by activists to call attention to the ways that inadequate access to food in the city is linked to legacies of racism in Baltimore. Of all communities of color in the city, Black communities are disproportionately more likely to have inadequate access to food. Though pushed to the edges of survival, Black life and landscapes in the city are thriving. Here are some of the many pictures I took during my time there this summer. On the left is a picture of the dye farm and garden at Blue Light Junction, which is a natural dye studio I'll talk more about in a later slide. And on the top right is a picture taken at Gwynns Falls Lincoln Park during a walking tour with chemist Zachary White, who is also on the board of Friends of Gwynns Falls Lincoln Park. And lastly, the bottom right is a picture of collards, chard, and kale I helped harvest while volunteering at Rock Rose Farm's charity garden. Now, I won't talk too much about Rock Rose today, but briefly, the Charity Garden is a church-based project initiated by Black environmentalist and activist Derek Weston and McKay Jenkins to address food apartheid in the city. So I came to Baltimore with established research connections with the Parks and People Foundation and the USDA Forest Service Field Station, as well as a broad guiding research question. What does Black environmental care and stewardship look like in Baltimore City? Answering this question required that I identify and connect with Black environmentalist groups and allied organizations. So for example, I knew that the Forest Service Field Station in Baltimore had been mapping civic groups engaged in environmental stewardship since 1996. So this database really became a useful starting point for my inquiry, as well as identifying key informants and contacting them. Within my field, this is a method called snowball sampling. And once I had identified key informants and Black-led environmentalist groups, I began conducting informal interviews, which looked a lot like hanging out and chatting with folks for hours at a time. I later coded or turned this collection of stories and interview data into broad themes, and much of what I will share with you over the coming slides comes from this preliminary data. On the right are a few of the organizations I managed to connect with in my short time over the summer. Now, I won't be able to go into all of these collaborations or talk about them in depth, but I will spend some time discussing a few over the coming slides. Some Black-led environmentalist groups include Bliss Meadows, Blue Light Junction, Parks and People, Still Meadow Peace Park, and Rock Rose's Charity Garden. And allied organizations include the USDA Forest Service, US Fish and Wildlife, Baltimore Green Space, Friends of Gwynns Falls Lincoln Park, and Nature Sacred. So Bliss Meadows is a 10-acre woodland farm located in the Frankford neighborhood of Northeast Baltimore. This environmental and food justice organization was founded by Atia Wells and is currently co-managed by her and a team of farmers and environmental educators. In my conversations with Atia, she shared with me stories of how she became involved in this work and her visions for the property as a safe space where people of color could come to learn about and explore nature on their own terms. Caught between this want for connecting her kids with nature, as well as deepening her own knowledge and connections through naturalist courses and outdoor recreation such as hiking, Atia founded Bliss Meadows with 5 key dimensions of programming in mind, or basically ways that she could better serve and engage her community in the outdoors, including through animal husbandry, as the woodland farm has bees, chickens, goats, and soon to be sheep. through conservation, as the farm is in the process of restoring a wildflower meadow and orchard on the property, along with the 7-acre woodland forest. Through community gardening and increasing food access, with limited access to quality food in the neighborhood, the community garden really emerged to meet this need, especially during COVID-19. And lastly, through environmental education, to provide local residents with opportunities to learn more about environmental science and stewardship. In many ways, Bliss Meadows has evolved out of this realization that if I need this and my family needs this, then other people need this too. Thus, restoring connections to nature became for Atiya, as it is for many Black Americans and Afro descendants around the world, and that is part of this collective healing journey. For example, Atiya is deeply inspired by scholar activist Leah Penniman's Farming While Black, which is a powerful manifesto encouraging Afro descendants to disrupt systemic racism in the food system by reclaiming their rightful place in the soil and revitalizing ancestral connections to land and nature, especially in places like the United States, where enslaved Africans played a large role in shaping ecologies, as well as building the food systems and economies of the Americas. And these ideas of reclaiming access to nature, as well as tapping into the restorative and transformative potential of green space in the city, from gardens to woodlands to parks, became among the more prominent themes to emerge from my informal interviews with everyday residents and environmentalists engaged in various forms of stewardship. Blue Light Junction is a natural dye garden and studio located in central Baltimore. The studio was founded by Kenya Miles, who is a textile artist, farmer, and natural dyer. While there in the city, I had the opportunity to attend a natural dye workshop at the studio, as well as hear more about Kenya's goals of being a good neighbor, steward, care practitioner, and integrating plants and people through natural dyeing. These dye plants, and in particular, the method of preparing and extracting their dyes, has taken Kenya all over the world, from Mexico to California, as well as connected her with other artists and natural dyers in the city like Rosa Chang, who also helps to run the studio. For Kenya and Rosa, growing, processing, and working with natural dye plants is a way to revitalize cultural, traditional, and ancestral connections to historical and medicinal plant species, all while also contributing to sustainable environmental stewardship models. At the workshop I attended, we learned about and worked closely with indigo, from its history and traditional preparation in the tropical regions of Asia and Africa, to its contemporary uses in Baltimore as part of the Natural Dye Initiative, which is a partnership with several institutions, from MICA to the Office of Sustainability to Parks and People, to bring the cultural, economic, environmental, and artistic values of natural dyes to Baltimore. Here is a photo of some of the textiles made at the workshop. Some of the fabrics we dyed included silks and cotton, and the methods used to dye each fabric were a little different. For example, we blended equal parts indigo leaves and water, and from that mixture, we separated the liquid from the paste. The liquid was then mixed with ice and used to dye the silks, and the paste was pressed into the cotton. And those intricate patterns you see were made from a pickling lime paste. We use leaves, flowers, and stencils to imprint these patterns into the fabric, or made freehand designs using paintbrushes in the paste. It was such a fascinating process that I'm curious to learn more about. And I even brought some indigo clippings home with me to do a bit of experimentation of my own. And they're actually still doing surprisingly well, even as it approaches winter in New England. So in addition to hosting a natural dye garden on its campus in Druid Hill Park as part of the Natural Dye Initiative, Parks and People is also involved in programming and development to increase people's access to green space in the city. The NGO is perhaps best known for many of the parks it's helped to design and build in neighborhoods across East and West Baltimore, including Henrietta Lacks Park, Kirby Lane Park, Darley Park, among others. And in my conversations with the president and CEO, Frank Lance, as well as other staff, I learned more about the successes and challenges of building parks and green space in the city. For example, I think we all know that just living near green space can bring enormous health and ecosystem benefits to neighborhoods and communities, which of course is well documented and captured in the literature. And from my own experiences, I quickly realized the benefit of these neighborhood parks in chatting with residents and collecting local stories. For example, in one of my conversations, this theme of nature, as transformative and healing emerged yet again, as one of the stewards of Kirby Lane Park, Donald, shared stories about how his involvement in park stewardship helped him to recover and heal from addiction. However, I also noticed that many of these neighborhood parks were going underutilized, which prompted me to think deeply about whether just living in close proximity to green space was truly enough, and about the benefits that are to be had from sustained engagement with green space in light of Donald's story. And of course, a lack of engagement in parks by residents of color in the city is deeply linked with legacies of racism and segregation, as Baltimore has this long history of denying Black residents access to parks. And of course, this is not a Baltimore specific problem, but a US problem, as national parks in this country have a similar legacy of segregating or denying people of color access, and consequently continue to go underutilized by these same communities today. However, I did see some promising models of community engagement in green space that we could learn from, especially as we think about how to get residents who have been historically denied access to parks to utilize and reclaim these spaces in the city for their own health and benefit. One model of community engagement in green space that I think we can learn from in Baltimore is the Peace Park at Still Meadow Church, which is a 10-acre woodland sanctuary and forest restoration project along Frederick Ave in West Baltimore. Now, during the summer, I became increasingly involved in the forest restoration efforts of this community, helping to clear the debris of tangled vines and sick and dying trees, as well as plant new trees, willows and poplars, and in general, just beautify the property and transform the forest into a sanctuary for healing. For example, this idea of woods for many residents in the city evokes a sense of fear or anxiety, and such feelings may be a part of this collective African-American memory in this country of woodland areas as sites of lynching and therefore unsafe. And these feelings may also be locally situated, as woodland parks like Winds Falls Lincoln Park, for example, has this history of being a dumping site for bodies and other discards. However, in my conversations with Pastor Michael Martin, I learned how these sites can also bring about healing and joy to people, and especially how in times of crisis, nature can be a powerful community building and organizing tool. For example, the Forest Restoration Project turned Peace Park began after a flood that devastated the community several years ago. So in the wake of environmental and climate crisis, the forest has become a way to mitigate some of these effects, including increased flood risk and heat stress. But it's also become a way to bring people together, including volunteers from the Forest Service, churchgoers and youth from surrounding communities, as well as volunteers from as far away as Kentucky and Tennessee to help repair the forest. And with that, or by engaging in these forms of stewardship, also transforming the community's relationship with nature. I mean, previously the forest was a dumping ground for trash, tires, and other waste, and now it's a space where people gather to be in communion with nature. Thus, the efforts of Black environmentalists across these sites in the city to not only transform and repair urban ecosystems damaged by these legacies of segregation, but also to revitalize community connections to nature, has really helped me to further develop what I'm calling Black environmentalism. I think previously environmental justice, at least for me, was really the only reference point I had, or we had, for how Black communities were thought to exist in cities. In a sea of toxic waste, for example, why they get involved in environmental advocacy work, and what those forms of environmental concern and activism look like. But what these sites in Baltimore demonstrate, as I'm sure is the case in other cities across the United States, is that Black environmentalism is more than just about responding to environmental harms, and Black residents are more than just victims of the environment. In many ways, my work is an effort to recover, to tell and honor the stories of Black Americans as environmental stewards. What if Black environmental care and stewardship are not contrast to mainstream environmentalism or conservation, but are instead seen as solutions to global environmental and climate crisis? Black environmentalism thus asks whether we might reconfigure ecological relationships in ways that are not only sustainable and just, but also underscore mutual caretaking obligations between humans and ecosystems. So next steps for me include presenting some of this work in greater detail at the annual American Anthropology Conference, which will be in Baltimore later this month from November 17th through the 21st. Additionally, I'm also in ongoing conversation with many of my collaborators on the Ecology of Racism book project about other projects to come from our work together, including a series of workshops and review publications. Lastly, as part of a huge milestone in my program, as well as to secure funding to be able to come back to the city to further this work through 12 months of ethnographic fieldwork, I'm in the process of writing a National Science Foundation grant proposal due early next year, as well as other grants in the spring. And some questions that I'm thinking deeply with and writing with include, how are Black Americans reconfiguring urban life and landscapes through environmental stewardship? What politics and histories animate these modes of Black environmental care and concern? And lastly, what visions of the future are enacted through these environmental care practices? And with that, I would be happy to take any questions, suggestions, or feedback on my current questions and ideas. And thank you all so much for having me and tuning into my talk.
Alexandria, thank you so very much. So we have two questions that I would love to present to you first. One is from our good friend Morgan. It's more of a statement than a question, but it's really also a question. He says, it's a profound question to ask, why do we know so little about Black stewardship? Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, it's a profound question. And I think where our understandings of Black environmental stewardship come from, or care come from, or how it's usually framed is in the context of mainstream conservation or mainstream environmentalism, which we know of as, say, like conservation and national parks sort of emerged out of this conservation movement. And in many ways, environmental justice as a movement emerged, I don't want to say in contrast, but in response to this mainstream ecological movement that was not really keeping in mind or acknowledging the environmental concerns of communities of color. I think within this mainstream conservation movement, we noticed that a lot of their environmental concerns were really the concerns of upper middle class and upper middle class white communities. And in many ways, environmental justice sort of emerged in response to that, to say, Black people have environmental concerns of their own, and this is what they look like. But I think even now, even today, or what I'm saying or what I'm seeing is that the only reference point we have for Black environmentalism is environmental justice. And I think, at least in terms of what I've observed in the city, it's so much more than just responding to environmental racism or responding to environmental toxics. it's also these other practices of, say, dye plant farming and gardening, which have emerged as a way to revitalize ancestral connections and histories of working with medicinal plants. For example, it's not so much this response to environmental racism, but something else entirely. And that's sort of what I mean, or what I'm trying to signal, is that something else is happening here.
So there are two clusters of questions I want to get at. Let me ask you this one first. This is from Stephanie Geller. Are the local projects that you've been researching, are they coming together for what she calls cross learning and larger advocacy? Do the individual groups that you've been focusing on, do they see themselves as a part of a movement, or are they see themselves as discrete entities? How do they see themselves?
Not yet, though I am recognizing that, as you say, these people do fit into this movement or this wave of environmentalism. But I think, you know, this whole effort of me to sort of identify these groups and survey or map them, so just identify them, and you know, for me, what that looks like is pasting them all into a spreadsheet and seeing these connections that cut across. But as individual organizations, there isn't this there isn't this cross collaboration or this connecting across their shared goals and interests. I think that's yet to be realized. I think for the most part, a lot of these groups don't even realize that other groups in the city are doing these kinds of work or different work. And I do realize that there is an effort to sort of, or a need to network these community organizations.
So it seems like there's an emergent movement, but the movement hasn't coalesced, you know, just yet, or fully recognized the other partners in this movement. So each one's growing up sort of sui generously, which is very exciting. All right, from Al Todd, and I think Al reflects some of the other questions that might be coming in. He says, many environmental groups are trying to determine how best they can act, he put acts in quotes, in support of issues of environmental justice. From what you've studied, what do you feel are the most effective or successful ways that you've seen groups use to help address environmental justice at various scales? I think that he's representing sort of a desire and a frustration that many people have. We want to do the right thing. We want to engage. How do we best do it?
Yeah, and maybe I'm not the best person to answer that question, because it's still something I'm thinking through myself. But I know, for example, folks like Glen Ross in Baltimore have been doing this work to make environmental injustices known in the city. And I think by linking with people like him, linking with local community activists and groups and asking them what they need and pitching in to help out with their projects is the best way to start.
Beth Heller asks, we know that Warren County was/is a rural area, and Baltimore is obviously an urban area. In your experience, how does environmental justice activism vary depending on place? Are Black environmentalists more active in rural or urban settings? She says, I took a course on environmental justice on the Anacostia River in DC this summer, and it was eye-opening. So do you see distinctions for where people are?
Yes. And I will say that, I mean, in thinking about sort of this historical context of Black people moving to the city to sort of, Black people moving to the city from the South. And I'm thinking in particular about, so you have these histories of environmental justice movements, but also you have these other histories of, say, for example, environmental justice around farming and agriculture that were happening in the South. So I would say that these context of environmental justice or environmental activism by Black groups looks different depending on where you are. In the South, it was primarily motivated around food and land and agriculture, and in the North, access to parks or toxics or air pollution, for example. And I think place certainly shapes the environments and sort of the things that people are interested in. And I wouldn't say that people in urban areas are more active than people in the South. I just think that what they're involved in or their environmental concerns look different based on place and the environments that they live in.
And it seemed as if you were saying, tell me if I'm correct, that the understanding the engagement of Black communities in environmental activism, even on their local level, nonetheless can and should be seen as part of the larger equation of responding to the more global issues that we face. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So I think what I'm trying to do when I say, what if Black environmentalism is seen as not in contrast to mainstream conservation and environmentalism, but instead as a solution to global environmental and climate crisis, is because it is, right? It's not just a response to environmental harms. I think many of the communities that I did have the opportunity to connect with while in Baltimore were deeply concerned about climate change. We're deeply concerned, for example, about the harms caused by our textile industry and the dyes used, for example, in the context of Blue Light Junction, and why they're trying to bring these benefits of indigo to Baltimore City. It's in response to that. And this idea of connecting plants and people is in response to that. If we can see plants as, if we can see the uses of plants in these ways, will we learn to value and care for ourselves and our planet differently? I think is one of the questions that Kenya Miles at least is operating with. And I think too, in the context of Still Meadow Peace Park, that emerged in response to a flood that devastated the community several years ago. And in many ways, this effort to plant trees is an effort to mitigate the effects of increased flood risk. So to increase the drainage properties of this forest. And also, planting more trees helps reduce heat stress. So I feel like a lot of what people are doing and engaging in the city is a direct response to this global context that we find ourselves in.
And you spoke about the I guess the historic alienation of members of the Black community to some of these public areas and forests. How do you think we can help overcome that?
Yeah, and this is a question that I'm still thinking with today. I'm not sure how, but I think some models that we do have to learn from, for example, are what I've seen at Still Meadow Peace Park. I think we really need to be asking Pastor Michael Martin what he has done to bring all of these people together, because I think, as Morgan mentioned in the chat, it was like almost 4,000 people over the course of this year coming in to help repair this forest. So I think, I don't know what he did, but it's worth asking.
You'll when you come back, you'll do some more research and you'll come back and tell us, right? Because
certainly,
we all want to repair that rift. It's just not healthy for anyone. So
certainly.
Any last questions before we close up? You can speak the questions if you don't want to write them in. If you've got a burning question, we have just another minute.
Hey, this is Rebecca, if you don't mind, if I could ask a question.
Please.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I really appreciate it. This year we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the 1991 People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit and the promulgation of the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice. And so just wondering, what are you seeing that's different? Because you've looked at the history and you've heard the perspectives of people that were in the movement, in the 80s and 90s. What is different about the movement now? What are you seeing, and does it give you hope for making the progress that we need to see and sort of the systemic and policy change that they were asking for 30, 50 years ago that we're kind of just beginning to implement now?
I wouldn't necessarily say the movement is so much different in that, some of our terms that we're operating within the movement, say environmental racism, have evolved to include not only just the discrimination or exclusion of people of color in policymaking, or the deliberate citing of toxic waste facilities. We're seeing environmental racism, for example, show up in who gets to go birding. And I'm speaking to specifically blackball birding conflicts. So in particular, the situation that happened between Christian Cooper in Central Park as he was birding, and Amy Cooper, a white woman, called the police on him. So, I mean, our understandings of environmental racism and what that looks like have evolved. And I think, I wouldn't even say, even thinking back to the 17 principles of environmental justice, of course, that also is speaking to, say, indigenous ways of thinking about and being in nature have been incorporated into that framework. And I think what we're seeing is that other place-based people, Afro-descendants in particular, are integrating those ways of being in place and being in land and bringing those into the context of, say, Baltimore, for example, in revitalizing their connections to traditional food practices or working with medicinal plants in a particular way. It's that same sort of thinking and being in place that is being transported to Baltimore. So what I would say is that it doesn't look different, but it's evolving. And I would say that policy change has taken so long to be implemented in the context of environmental justice that local communities are really just doing things themselves. So I think I didn't mention this in my presentation, but in the context of Stowe Meadow Peace Park, for example, that neighborhood has this history of being, or what people would describe is this feeling of abandonment or neglect by the city or by the state. And I think in the absence of state support and resources, what this community has done is come together and repair that forest themselves. And I think a lot of what we're seeing on the ground is that, in the absence of state resources, in the absence of much needed and necessary policy change, local communities are doing that work themselves. And I think in many ways that is, I said it wasn't different, but maybe that's a slight difference in that, it's not this. It's likely working on both levels, but at the local level, it's less of this waiting around for policy to change and more of this, what can we do? How can we come together? Climate crisis is here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Alexandria. This was wonderful. We hope that you do come back to Baltimore and continue your research and come back and talk to us about it. We do believe that there is great power in the people. And one of the things we want to do is make sure we continue to assist in giving the power to the people through the Environmental Human Rights Amendment that we're also doing, which we hope enables all communities to create greater, more regenerative, healthy, joyful, recreational, green spaces in their own neighborhoods. So thank you for introducing us to these ideas. You're wonderful. We hope to have you back. Thank you all for coming. We will be sending out this recording to everyone who registered so that you can see it again and pick up some of the nuances that you might have missed, and continue to support us. We need you. We're so grateful to have you here. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.